In a quiet little village surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills, life moved at its own gentle pace. The air was always filled with the sweet scent of wildflowers, and the sound of birds chirping echoed through the trees. This was home for Eldrick and his wife, Leela, a place where everyone knew each other's names, and kindness was more common than cruelty. Eldrick worked as a blacksmith, hammering away at glowing red metal all day long to craft tools, orshows, and sometimes even swords for travelers passing through. His hands were calloused from years of hard work, but his heart was soft, especially when it came to Leela. Leela was the light of Eldrick's life. She had a warm smile that could brighten even the gloomiest days, and a laugh so infectious that it made everyone around her feel lighter. While Eldrick spent his hours shaping iron in the forge, Leela kept their small cottage cozy and welcoming. Her garden overflowed with vibrant vegetables and herbs, and she often baked fresh bread that filled their home with an irresistible aroma. Together, they shared simple joys, sitting by the fire after dinner, talking about their dreams, or strolling hand in hand under the starlit sky. Life wasn't perfect, but it was enough. However, whispers of trouble began to drift into the village like an unwelcome breeze. People spoke of the king's guards, who patrolled the countryside enforcing laws, but rarely showing respect to the villagers. These guards were known for their arrogance and harshness, treating ordinary people as if they were beneath them. Some claimed the guards demanded free food and shelter wherever they went, while others said they shouted orders just to watch people scramble in fear. Though none of this had directly affected Eldrick and Leela yet, the stories left a bitter taste in everyone's mouths. One sunny afternoon, Eldrick paused mid-stroke while working on a plowshare and glanced toward the village square. A group of royal guards marched through the cobblestone streets, their polished armor gleaming in the sunlight. They carried themselves with an air of superiority, as though they owned the very ground beneath their boots. Villagers stepped aside quickly, avoiding eye contact and keeping their heads low. Eldrick frowned as he watched them pass. Something about their demeanor didn't sit right with him. It reminded him of storm clouds gathering before a thunderstorm, ominous and full of potential danger. Later that evening, as Eldrick sat across from Leela at their wooden table, he mentioned what he'd seen. "Those guards," he said, shaking his head. "They strut around like kings themselves. I don't trust them." Leela nodded thoughtfully, twirling a strand of her golden-brown hair between her fingers. "I've heard the same stories," she admitted softly. "But let's hope we never cross paths with them." Eldrick reached across the table and took her hand in his. "We won't," he promised firmly. "No one will hurt you, not while I'm here." His words were meant to reassure her, but deep down, a nagging worry lingered in his mind. What if the guards' behavior grew worse? What if they decided to flex their authority in ways that couldn't be ignored? For now, though, Eldrick pushed those thoughts aside. He wanted to focus on the present, the warmth of his home, the love of his wife, and the peaceful rhythm of their lives. Little did he know that peace would soon be shattered in a way he couldn't have imagined. The next morning dawned bright and clear, with the sun casting golden rays over the village. Leela woke up early, humming a soft tune as she prepared for her trip to the market. She needed fresh vegetables, herbs, and perhaps a small treat, a sweet pastry or two, to surprise Eldrick when he returned from the forge. The market was always bustling at this time of day, filled with vendors calling out their wares and villagers haggling over prices. It was one of Leela's favorite places, a lively spot where she often exchanged smiles and greetings with familiar faces. As she walked through the cobblestone streets, basket in hand, Leela felt the usual comfort of routine. She stopped by the vegetable stall first, carefully inspecting tomatoes and carrots before making her selection. The vendor, an elderly man named Jonas, gave her a warm smile. "Always picking the best, aren't you, Leela?" he teased good-naturedly. She laughed, thanking him as she handed over a few coins. But just as she turned to leave, a sudden commotion caught her attention. A group of royal guards had entered the marketplace, their armor clinking loudly with each step. They moved like a storm cloud rolling in, parting the crowd effortlessly as people scrambled to get out of their way. Lila froze for a moment, unsure what to do. She didn't want to draw any attention to herself, but there was nowhere to go. She was surrounded by stalls and other shoppers. One of the guards, a tall and broad-shouldered man with a scowl etched onto his face, strode ahead of the group. This was Captain Roderick. Though Lila didn't know his name yet, all she saw was his imposing figure and the way he shoved past people without a second thought. As he approached, Lila instinctively stepped back, trying to make room. But the narrow path between the stalls left little space, and in her haste, she accidentally bumped into him. The collision was slight, barely noticeable, but it was enough to send Roderick into a rage. He spun around, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Lila. "How dare you touch me, wench?" he bellowed, his voice cutting through the noise of the market like a knife. Everyone nearby fell silent, their eyes wide with shock and fear. Lila stumbled backward, clutching her basket tightly. Her heart raced as she stammered, I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to. Didn't mean to." Roderick interrupted, his tone dripping with disdain. "Do you have any idea who I am? I am Captain Roderick of the King's Guard. You should be groveling at my feet, not daring to lay a finger on me." His words echoed through the square, drawing even more stares from passers-by. Lila's cheeks burned with embarrassment. She tried to apologize again, her voice trembling. "Please forgive me, sir. It was an accident. I swear." But Roderick wasn't listening. Instead, he leaned closer, his face twisted with anger. "An accident?" he sneered. "If I wanted excuses, I'd ask for them. Now bow your head and show some respect." By now, a large crowd had gathered, watching the scene unfold in stunned silence. No one dared to intervene, not even the vendors who had been chatting cheerfully moments ago. Lila felt tears welling up in her eyes as she bowed her head, humiliated and terrified. Roderick glared at her for a few more seconds before turning away with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Pathetic," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for those nearby to hear. As the guards continued their march through the market, the crowd slowly dispersed, murmuring amongst themselves about what had just happened. Lila stood frozen for a moment longer, her hands shaking as she clutched her basket. Finally, she forced herself to move, hurrying home as fast as her legs would carry her. The cheerful mood she'd started the day with was gone, replaced by a heavy weight of shame and fear that settled deep in her chest. When she reached the cottage, she collapsed onto a chair, tears streaming down her face. She knew Eldrick would return soon, and the thought of telling him what had happened filled her with dread. How could she explain something so humiliating? Yet, as much as she wished she could forget the incident, she also knew she couldn't keep it hidden. Not from the man who loved her more than anything in the world. When Eldrick returned home that evening, the scent of burning coals still clinging to his clothes, he immediately sensed that something was wrong. The cottage, usually filled with the warmth of Lila's laughter or the comforting aroma of her cooking, felt heavy and quiet. He found her sitting by the hearth, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, staring blankly into the flickering flames. Her eyes were red and swollen, evidence of tears shed not long ago. "Lila," Eldrick called softly, setting down his tools near the door. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" She turned to look at him, her lower lip trembling as she tried to speak. For a moment, no words came out, only a shaky breath that broke Eldrick's heart. Finally, she whispered, "It's nothing. I'm fine." But Eldrick wasn't convinced. He knelt beside her, taking her hands in his rough, calloused ones. "You're not fine," he said firmly yet gently. "Tell me what happened. Did someone upset you?" At first, Lila hesitated. She didn't want to burden Eldrick with her troubles, especially when there was little he could do about them. But the weight of the day pressed down on her, and soon the story spilled out in halting sentences. She told him about going to the market, bumping into the guard, and how the man, Captain Roderick, had shouted at her in front of everyone. As she recounted the humiliation, fresh tears streamed down her face. Eldrick listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening with every word. His mind raced with anger and disbelief. How could anyone treat his kind, gentle wife like that? The thought of Leela standing there, frightened and humiliated, made his blood boil. Yet he forced himself to stay calm for her sake. When she finished speaking, he pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her protectively. "I'm so sorry this happened to you," he murmured into her hair. "No one should ever speak to you that way. You did nothing wrong." Leela sniffled, leaning into his embrace. "I know," she whispered, "but what can we do? He's a guard, a powerful man. We're just ordinary people." Eldrick didn't answer right away. Instead, he sat quietly, his mind working through the storm of emotions inside him. He knew Leela was right. The guards held authority, and challenging them could have serious consequences. But the idea of doing nothing, of letting Roderick's cruelty go unchecked, gnawed at him. Wasn't it better to stand up for what was right, even if it meant risking everything? That night, sleep eluded Eldrick. He lay awake beside Leela, staring at the ceiling as thoughts swirled in his head. What kind of man would he be if he let fear dictate his actions? Would he regret staying silent if Roderick continued to bully others? And most importantly, how could he live with himself knowing he hadn't protected the person he loved most? By dawn, Eldrick had made up his mind. He wouldn't confront Roderick recklessly. He valued his life and Leela's safety too much for that. But neither would he sit idly by while injustice festered. There had to be a way to hold the guard accountable without putting himself or his family in unnecessary danger. The next morning, Eldrick rose early, leaving Leela still asleep in bed. He walked to the edge of the village, where the fields stretched out toward the horizon, and stood alone under the pale light of sunrise. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. Whatever happened next, he vowed to face it with courage, not just for himself, but for Leela and everyone else who had suffered because of men like Roderick. As he turned back toward the village, a strange sense of calm settled over him. He didn't know how things would unfold, but one thing was certain. He wouldn't let fear silence him. Not this time. The next morning, Eldrick woke with a sense of purpose that outweighed his lingering fear. He knew confronting Captain Roderick wouldn't be easy or safe, but he also knew he couldn't let the guard's cruelty go unchallenged. After a quiet breakfast with Leela, who watched him with worried eyes, Eldrick kissed her forehead and reassured her. "I'll be careful," he promised. "But I can't stay silent about this." With determination burning in his chest, Eldrick made his way to the local tavern. It was early, but the guards often gathered there after their morning patrols, drinking ale and boasting about their exploits. As Eldrick pushed open the heavy wooden door, the smell of stale beer and roasted meat hit him. The room was dimly lit, filled with the low murmur of conversation. Sure enough, Captain Roderick sat at a corner table with two other guards, laughing loudly as he recounted some exaggerated tale of bravery. Eldrick hesitated for just a moment, his heart pounding like a blacksmith's hammer against an anvil. Then, taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, weaving through the tables until he stood directly in front of Roderick. The guard looked up, his laughter fading into a scowl as he recognized the man before him. "You?" Eldrick said, his voice steady despite the nerves twisting in his stomach. "You dishonored my wife yesterday." The entire tavern fell silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, tankards froze halfway to lips, and all eyes turned toward the confrontation brewing between the blacksmith and the guard. Roderick leaned back in his chair, his expression darkening as he studied Eldrick with obvious disdain. "And who are you, peasant, to speak to me like that?" Roderick growled, his tone dripping with mockery. "Do you even know who I am?" "I'm her husband," Eldrick replied firmly, standing tall despite the fact that Roderick towered over him. "What gives you the right to treat her, or anyone, with such cruelty? She did nothing to deserve your anger." Roderick's lip curled into a sneer. "Nothing," She bumped into me. Me, a captain of the King's Guard. He slammed his fist on the table, causing mugs to rattle. If I'd wanted to, I could have her whipped for such disrespect. A murmur rippled through the crowd of onlookers, but no one dared to intervene. Eldrick felt the weight of their stares, yet he refused to back down. She apologized. He shot back, his voice rising slightly. She meant no harm, but instead of accepting her apology, you humiliated her in front of everyone. That wasn't justice, it was cruelty. For a moment, Roderick simply stared at him, clearly stunned that someone would dare challenge him so openly. Then, a slow, cold smile spread across his face. "Brave words for a blacksmith," he said mockingly. "Or maybe you're just stupid. Do you really think you can stand here and lecture me?" "I'm not lecturing you," Eldrick replied, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I'm telling you that what you did was wrong. And if you won't admit it, then I'll make sure others hear about it too." The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the other guards exchanged uneasy glances, unsure how far this confrontation would go. Roderick rose slowly from his seat, his towering frame casting a shadow over Eldrick. For a moment, it seemed like he might strike the blacksmith down where he stood. Instead, he laughed, a harsh, hollow sound that echoed off the tavern walls. "Very well, blacksmith," Roderick said, his voice icy. "Let's see how brave you are when you're locked in the stocks for your insolence." With a sharp gesture, he signaled to his men, who moved swiftly to grab Eldrick by the arms. Eldrick didn't resist. He knew struggling would only make things worse. As the guards dragged him out of the tavern, the villagers whispered among themselves, torn between admiration for Eldrick's courage and fear of what might happen to him. Though his heart raced with apprehension, Eldrick kept his head high. Whatever punishment awaited him, he had spoken his truth, and that, he realized, was worth more than any amount of fear. Eldrick's punishment came swiftly and without mercy. By midday, he was locked in the village stocks, his arms and legs pinned uncomfortably in place as curious, and sometimes pitying, villagers passed by. The wooden frame dug into his skin, and the sun beat down mercilessly on his exposed neck. Despite the discomfort, Eldrick kept his gaze steady, refusing to let humiliation break him. He knew this moment wasn't just about him. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it hurt. Word of Eldrick's defiance spread quickly through the village. Some people stopped to gawk at the blacksmith-turned-martyr, while others whispered words of encouragement as they walked past. "You did the right thing," one elderly woman murmured, pressing a loaf of bread into his hands before scurrying away. A young boy lingered nearby, staring wide-eyed at Eldrick with a mixture of awe and confusion. "Why'd you yell at the guard?" the boy asked innocently. Eldrick managed a small smile despite his predicament. "Because no one should treat another person like that, not even someone with power." As the hours dragged on, Eldrick began to feel the weight of his decision. His muscles ached from being held in the same position for so long, and his throat was dry from thirst. Yet every time doubt crept into his mind. He reminded himself why he had done it, for Leela, for justice, and for everyone who had ever been silenced by fear. Meanwhile, news of Eldrick's confrontation reached beyond the village borders. Among those who heard the story was Maris, a traveling bard known for her sharp wit and soulful songs. She had been staying in the village temporarily, performing at the local inn to earn her keep. When she learned about Eldrick's bravery and the cruelty of Captain Roderick, she felt a spark of inspiration ignite within her. That evening, after finishing her performance, Maris sat by candlelight in her modest room, penning a ballad titled "The Blacksmith's Stand." Her lyrics painted a vivid picture of Eldrick's courage, contrasting it sharply with Roderick's arrogance. By morning, the song was ready, and Maris wasted no time sharing it with the world. She sang the ballad first at the inn, where villagers gathered to hear her nightly tales. As her voice soared through the crowded room, describing how Eldrick had faced down the tyrannical guard, the audience erupted into applause. Many wiped tears from their eyes, moved not only by the melody, but also by the truth behind the words. The next day, Maris took her song to neighboring towns, spreading Eldric's story far and wide. Each performance drew larger crowds, and soon, whispers of the brave blacksmith reached ears far beyond the humble village. Back in the village, the impact of Eldric's actions became undeniable. Delegations from nearby settlements arrived, demanding answers from the king's officials about the behavior of his guards. Farmers, merchants, and even clergy joined forces, presenting petitions signed by hundreds of citizens calling for accountability. Even some members of the royal court grew uneasy, realizing that public outrage could threaten the stability of the kingdom if left unchecked. For the first time in years, ordinary people found their voices, emboldened by Eldric's example. Captain Roderick, however, remained defiant. When questioned by his superiors about the incident, he dismissed Eldric's accusations as mere exaggeration. "He's a peasant," Roderick sneered during one heated exchange. "What does he know of honor or duty? I acted within my rights." But cracks were beginning to show in his armor of arrogance. Rumors swirled that the king himself had taken notice of the growing unrest, ordering an investigation into the conduct of his guards. By the third day, Eldric was finally released from the stocks. His body ached, and his pride had taken a beating, but his spirit remained unbroken. As he limped home, villagers lined the streets, offering quiet nods of respect or placing gentle hands on his shoulder. Lila waited anxiously at their cottage, rushing to embrace him the moment he stepped inside. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Eldric hugged her tightly, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Though the battle wasn't over, he knew he had struck a blow against injustice, one that resonated far beyond the confines of their little village. For now, the storm had passed, but the winds of change were blowing stronger than ever, and Eldric, though weary, stood ready to face whatever came next. The days following Eldric's release from the stocks were a whirlwind of activity. News of his bravery and the injustice he had faced continued to spread like wildfire, fueled by Maris's heartfelt ballad. Travelers carried the song across rivers and mountains, singing it in taverns, marketplaces, and even royal courts. The tale of the humble blacksmith who stood up to a tyrannical guard resonated deeply with people from all walks of life. Farmers paused their plowing to listen, merchants hummed the melody as they worked, and children played games inspired by Eldric's courage. In the village, the atmosphere shifted noticeably. What had once been fear and silence was now replaced with quiet determination. Villagers began speaking more openly about their own encounters with the king's guards, stories of unfair taxes, stolen goods, and harsh punishments for minor offenses. These accounts, long buried under layers of intimidation, surfaced one by one, painting a troubling picture of systemic abuse. Eldric's act of defiance had given others the courage to share their truths, creating an unshakable wave of solidarity. Maris, sensing the growing momentum, decided to take things further. She traveled to the capital city, where she performed the blacksmith's stand in front of a packed crowd at the grand marketplace. Her voice rang out clear and powerful, capturing not only the villagers' plight, but also the universal longing for fairness and dignity. By the end of her performance, the audience erupted into cheers, some even chanting Eldric's name. Word of the bard's song reached the ears of influential figures within the royal court, including advisors to the king himself. One such advisor, Lord Cedric, was particularly moved. A man of principle and wisdom, he had grown increasingly concerned about the growing unrest among the kingdom's citizens. When he heard Maris's ballad, he saw an opportunity to address the issue head-on. He arranged for her to perform privately before the king, knowing that music often carried truths too delicate for plain speech. When Maris sang in the opulent throne room, the air seemed to still. The king, a stern yet thoughtful ruler, listened intently as the bard wove Eldric's story into a tapestry of emotion and morality. As the final notes faded, the king leaned back in his throne, his brow furrowed in deep thought. For a moment, No one spoke. Then, breaking the silence, Lord Cedric stepped forward. "Your Majesty," he said respectfully, "this is not an isolated incident. It reflects a pattern, one that threatens the bond between your people and your crown. If left unchecked, it could weaken the very foundation of our kingdom." The king nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Summon the blacksmith," he commanded after a pause, "and bring Captain Roderick before me as well." Back in the village, when messengers arrived with the summons, Eldrick felt a mix of dread and resolve. Lila clung to him, her eyes wide with worry. "What if this goes wrong?" she asked softly. Eldrick placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We've come this far," he replied. "I won't back down now." Accompanied by a small delegation of villagers, Eldrick made the journey to the capital. Along the way, strangers greeted him warmly, offering food, shelter, and words of encouragement. By the time they reached the palace gates, Eldrick realized he was no longer just fighting for himself or Leela. He represented everyone who had ever been silenced by power. Inside the grand hall, the tension was palpable. Captain Roderick stood defiantly beside his fellow guards, sneering at Eldrick as though nothing had changed. But when the king called upon Eldrick to speak, the blacksmith stood tall, his voice steady despite the imposing surroundings. He recounted the events in the marketplace, describing how Roderick had humiliated Leela and dismissed her apology with cruelty. Eldrick didn't embellish or exaggerate. He simply told the truth, letting its weight speak for itself. As Eldrick finished, the king turned to Roderick. "Is this true?" he demanded. The captain hesitated, clearly unprepared for the scrutiny. "It was a minor incident, Your Majesty," he stammered. "The woman disrespected me. I merely upheld my authority." The king's eyes narrowed. "Authority does not grant you the right to mistreat my subjects," he said sharply. Turning to Eldrick, he added, "You have shown great courage, blacksmith. Because of you, I see what has been hidden from me for too long." With those words, the tide began to turn. Eldrick's simple act of standing up for justice had sparked a chain reaction, uniting ordinary people and awakening the conscience of the crown. Though the road ahead would be challenging, hope flickered brightly. For the first time in years, change seemed possible. The grand hall of the palace was silent except for the echo of the king's voice as he addressed both Eldrick and Captain Roderick. The tension in the room was thick, like a storm about to break. Eldrick stood tall, his heart pounding, but his resolve unwavering. He had come this far, and now it was up to the king to decide whether justice would prevail. "Captain Roderick," the king began, his tone firm and commanding, "you are accused of abusing your authority and treating my subjects with cruelty. What do you have to say for yourself?" Roderick shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the king's gaze. For the first time, his usual arrogance faltered. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice less confident than before, "I acted within my rights as a guard. These peasants need discipline. They cannot be allowed to disrespect their betters." The king's expression darkened. "Respect is earned, not demanded through fear and violence," he said sharply. "You wear the armor of my kingdom, yet you bring shame to it with your actions. Do you think I'd want my people living in fear of those meant to protect them?" Before Roderick could respond, the king turned to Eldrick. "And you, blacksmith, why did you risk so much to confront him?" Eldrick took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Your Majesty, I only wanted what any man would want, to protect my family and ensure that no one else suffers such humiliation. I didn't seek trouble, but when someone abuses their power, we must speak out. Silence only allows injustice to grow." The king nodded thoughtfully, clearly moved by Eldrick's sincerity. After a long pause, he rose from his throne, signaling that his decision had been made. "Captain Roderick," he declared, his voice ringing through the hall, "you are hereby stripped of your rank and banished from this kingdom. You will leave at once and never return. If you dare set foot here again, you will face imprisonment, or worse." Gasps rippled through the crowd gathered in the hall. No one had expected such a severe punishment, least of all Roderick himself. His face turned pale, and for a moment he looked as though he might argue. But the king's stern glare silenced him, and without another word, he was escorted away by royal guards. Turning back to Eldrick, the king's expression softened. "As for you, blacksmith, you have done this kingdom a great service. Your courage has reminded us all of the importance of fairness and respect. From this day forward, reforms will be implemented to ensure that no citizen suffers at the hands of those sworn to protect them." The announcement sent waves of relief and joy through the delegation of villagers who had accompanied Eldrick. They cheered quietly, tears streaming down many faces. Eldrick bowed deeply, humbled by the king's words. "Thank you, Your Majesty," he said simply. "This is more than I ever hoped for." When Eldrick returned to the village, he was greeted like a hero. The streets were lined with cheering villagers, throwing flower petals and clapping enthusiastically. Children ran alongside him, chanting his name, while elders patted him on the back with pride. It was a scene unlike anything the quiet blacksmith had ever imagined, yet he accepted it graciously, knowing it wasn't just about him. It was about hope restored. Life in the village changed almost overnight. With Captain Roderick gone and new regulations in place, the king's guards became noticeably kinder and more respectful during their patrols. Villagers no longer feared speaking up if they felt wronged, and a sense of unity blossomed among them. Eldrick found himself at the center of this transformation, often called upon to mediate disputes or offer advice. Though he never sought leadership, his actions had earned him the trust and admiration of everyone around him. Leela, too, emerged stronger from the ordeal. The shy, gentle woman who had once avoided conflict now joined Eldrick in advocating for others. Together, they became a symbol of resilience and love, a reminder that even ordinary people can spark extraordinary change. Their home remained a haven of warmth and laughter, but it also became a meeting place for villagers eager to discuss ways to improve their community. Maris continued to travel, her ballads spreading far beyond the borders of the kingdom. Wherever she went, she told the story of Eldrick and Leela, not just as a tale of bravery, but as proof that standing up for what's right can inspire others to do the same. Her song became a rallying cry for those seeking justice, sung in taverns, festivals, and even royal courts across distant lands. Though Eldrick never sought fame, his legacy lived on in countless ways. Farmers named their strongest oxen after him. Bards composed new verses inspired by his courage, and parents told their children bedtime stories about the blacksmith who challenged a tyrant. Yet despite all the attention, Eldrick remained humble, focusing on his work and his family. One evening, as he sat by the fire with Leela, Eldrick reflected on everything that had happened. "Do you think things will stay better?" Leela asked softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I think we've planted a seed," Eldrick replied, gazing into the flames. "Change isn't easy, and it won't happen overnight. But as long as people remember to stand up for each other, there's always hope." Outside, the stars twinkled brightly in the night sky, casting a gentle glow over the peaceful village. Life wasn't perfect, but it was enough. And sometimes, that was all anyone could ask for.